Hello, everybody. My name is Josh Whalen. I am the CEO and founder of Blokes, and my beautiful wife, Katie Whalen, is joining us as well. And she is my co-founder, basically co-CEO of Joy and Blokes. And we have an amazing guest, somebody I've known now for a little over 2 years, Dr. Ben Bikman, but we're going to call him Ben on this because that's what he prefers. And Ben and I have known each other, like I said, for a while. He's an amazing, amazing PhD out of Utah, has a loving family, and has been so kind and gracious to allow us the opportunity to pick his brain on metabolic health and everything going on around that subject matter. Thank you for joining us, Ben. Why don't you say hello?
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah, thank you, Josh and Katie and Riley, for helping behind the scenes. I really am delighted. It is so fun for an old professor to have a new crop of students to share some ideas with. And I have a very personal interest in this. Blokes has been very good to me, and I have really appreciated some of the insight. As a guy who's knocking on 50, it's fun to have your kids have to tell you every morning, Dad, put your shirt on, because you just want to walk around with your shirt off because you feel so damn good. Anyway, yeah, so it's fun being a scientist on the topic, and I have a personal interest involved in this as well.
Yeah, I think my kids tell me the same thing. So well, let's get into it. How we plan to do this is just we're going to take a lot of questions from the audience towards the end, but really just start with some baseline education. Katie and I will just kind of dive in, and I will tell you I've learned a lot through you in terms of just metabolic health. Insulin resistance, but it took me, even as the founder of a company that deals with this every single day, a little bit of homework and digging in to understand it. So, one thing I thought would be great is just to give a baseline on metabolic health and what it actually is, because I think there's a lot of people who think they know what it is, but I think just giving a good baseline would be a good way to start.
Yeah, oh, that's a great way to start the conversation. Thanks. Yeah, I really appreciate the approach because not only does it allow us to put metabolic health in its proper place, which is a foundational focus on health, but then we have to define that term. As much as I appreciate this current interest in metabolic health, love or hate the new administration, you got to appreciate that at a federal level, there's a renewed, or for the first time, a real focus on things that were earlier not really discussed. How I define metabolic health as a metabolic scientist is sort of a two-step process based on the way this is discussed within the biomedical realm. The first thing is very commonly when scientists and clinicians are talking about metabolic health, they often talk about something called the metabolic syndrome. And the metabolic syndrome is this cluster of problems where the person will have more belly fat. And then where Blokes and Joy comes in, it's all these blood measurements and health measurements like, blood pressure, but then things like glucose, triglycerides, and HDL. Now, interestingly, all of those metabolic syndrome related complications are actually all derivative of one problem. And this is reflected in what metabolic syndrome used to be called. What we call the metabolic syndrome used to be called the insulin resistance syndrome. And thus, my long winded roundabout way of answering the question of what is metabolic health is no more and no less than the question, where are you on the spectrum of insulin resistance? The more insulin resistant you are, the more you're not only going to have all of these features of the metabolic syndrome, but also the features of chronic diseases like Alzheimer's disease, insulin resistance of the brain, the most common form of infertility in women, PCOS, that's insulin resistance affecting the ovaries. Even in men, erectile dysfunction, insulin resistance is the leading cause of erectile dysfunction in otherwise healthy men. And to varying degrees, you can kind of go through all of these, what I call plagues of prosperity, these diseases that were once unheard of. And what they all have in common is this connection to insulin resistance. To varying degrees, every modern chronic disease is directly caused by or made worse by insulin resistance. And to my great delight, when within the Blokes Enjoy structure, people can get multiple markers of where they are on this spectrum of insulin resistance. So there needs not be any ambiguity. But conventional clinical care, maybe my final point in an answer that's already going too long, is that the modern medical focus has a glucose centric paradigm where they look at blood glucose. And that is, it's not wrong, but it is the wrong marker because it comes in too late. That insulin resistance is a state of elevated insulin where insulin isn't working very well and the body has a lot more insulin, but it's enough to keep the glucose in check. And then it's only once the body becomes so resistant to insulin that now the blood glucose levels start to climb. But that is a later marker. So the glucose may not change until, well, ever, but it may take 10 or 20 or 30 years before the glucose moves. But in the interim, they're getting dyslipidemia, their triglycerides are going through the roof, their cognitive decline is dropping, they're maybe having some muscle loss because of the insulin resistance of the muscle, and so on. And so by having a paradigm that focuses on insulin, we are able to detect the problem sooner and to introduce interventions that address it better, which is almost, it is always, not almost, always it's going to be lifestyle based. So proper diet and supplementation and supplements, that is the way to improve insulin sensitivity rather than masking the problem with various types of, nowadays just drugs that just sometimes can get it a little wrong. Not that there isn't a place for certain drugs and peptides and interventions. There absolutely is, but it needs to be going along with, of course, some changes in the food we're eating and how often we're eating it.
That's awesome. And by the way, I appreciate the long-winded answers because I'm learning as hopefully as much as our audience is. So one of the things that I didn't realize prior to really digging into metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance are not the same thing. They are basically factors of one another, correct?
Yeah. So yeah, the insulin, the metabolic syndrome is this observation that certain problems tend to come together. And then my point is simply that if we look at them, they're not unrelated, and that by acknowledging that what we call the metabolic syndrome used to be called the insulin resistance syndrome, it's actually a little more of a precise term because it helps us understand what they all have in common.
Amazing. So one of the things that I think is good to understand is Katie and I were just talking prior to this is we live in a metabolically unhealthy society, especially the United States. Um, what do you think has been just the tipping scale to get us to this point? Because you talked a little bit about it. I mean, there's the whole Maha movement, like them, hate them, whatever it is. It's the first time it's really getting on the front stage. Where do you think things just went wrong in society to put us here?
Well,
Hmm.
can I also say this? Like Chat GPT will tell you 93% of Americans are metabolically unhealthy, which is scary and blows my mind because that's most people. So like how do you know you're like, is it like you
Mm.
said, just a spectrum?
Yeah.
So most people are on the spectrum, but you could be just slightly metabolically unhealthy
Oh,
or
sure. Yeah. Yeah. So, Katie, that's the most sobering statistic I've heard yet. I am familiar with one that's not far off, though. A paper was published in 2016 that was based on a national survey of how many adults had multiple parts of the metabolic syndrome, those five problems I mentioned earlier. And they found that it was 88% of US adults, regardless of their body weight, had, in fact, their words were alarmingly low. And it's uncommon for scientists to use that kind of colorful language. It's often the most boring, dry type of drivel you could imagine. But they noted that there was an alarmingly low amount of optimal or good metabolic health based on that. So the number's not far off, about 9 and 10. Um, Now, how could you know? Well, part of it could be the parts of the metabolic syndrome that I mentioned earlier, like for example, high blood pressure. The absolute reigning number one cause of high blood pressure is insulin resistance. So if someone has been told they have high blood pressure and there's no sort of known defect that's causing it, Look no further than insulin resistance. Insulin resistance affects the caliber of the blood vessel, promoting hypertension and erectile dysfunction in men, by the way, through the same mechanism. But it also has a direct effect on the kidney, forcing the kidney to hold on to water more than it would. And that higher body water leads to higher blood volume, which leads to higher blood pressure. So that is one obvious marker of insulin resistance. Also, the skin, independent of the markers that someone can get from Blokes Enjoy, if some look around the neck, that there are two things around the neck that can happen. One is called a condition called acanthosis nigricans, and you could look that up. But it basically is this kind of crinkled tissue paper skin, where the skin is like the texture of crinkled tissue paper around the neck, and it can get a little darker pigmented. Of course, depending on the person's natural pigment, that may be more or less obvious. But it can happen around the neck or the armpit area or the groin. At that same area, a person can have these little teeny mushroom stalks of skin called skin tags. You guys all know what I'm talking about. You've seen them before. Skin tags are almost absolute proof positive of insulin resistance. They are so impacted by the elevated insulin of insulin resistance, resulted in this kind of frenzied growth of the skin cells. The good news is, as the skin is so dynamic and turns over so quickly, as insulin resistance gets better, those skin disorders can be gone in just weeks. And there are a handful of other things, like maybe the last one I'll mention is if you have a first degree relative, like a parent who has type 2 diabetes, your likelihood of having insulin resistance is multiples higher than someone who doesn't have that same familial connection. There really is this familial aspect to it. So those are some things that people could keep in mind. And of course, if you've gone through the blood tests with Blokes Enjoy, you don't have to have any ambiguity. There are multiple tests, including fasting insulin and the HOMA, HOMA score, that are both outputs on your lab values. Look at those. If your insulin level is 6 microunits per mil or less, that's a great sign. It's a solid evidence that you're insulin sensitive. If your HOMA score, HOMA, which Blokes Enjoy gets by using the fasting insulin and the fasting glucose, if that's less than 1.5, that's another really good sign. Your triglyceride to HDL ratio, if it's less than around 2, although there's some shifting across ethnicities, that's a good sign. So there are some tests that all of you would have access to, that you could look and it would remove any of the ambiguity. So that's how you can know. And then, Josh, with your question, how did we get it so wrong? It's hard to point to a specific instance, but if there is one, it is likely the work of an American scientist named Dr. Ansel Keys, where he published a number of decades ago, in the 1950s, I think, he published a report called the 7-Country Study. Now, that sounds like a White Stripes song, and it almost is, but not quite. The 7-Country Study looked at the consumption of saturated fats and then correlated that with the incidence of heart disease. And that was very popular, a very important topic at the time, because people were very worried about heart disease. I think it was, I don't know who the president was at the time, I don't think Roosevelt, whoever it was. I'm a Canadian, so I blame my Canadian ignorance in this case. But there was a president who had had a heart attack. And so this was very much a part of the kind of American conversation sometime before that. And so there was this war on fat. Now, this was not without controversy at the time. There was considerable debate, but this led to the initiation of the dietary guidelines for Americans, which the president of the Physiology Society in America viciously opposed. He said essentially, what right does the government have to conduct an experiment with the US population as its study subjects by basically promoting a low-fat diet? He said there's no evidence to support this. And even Dr. Ansel Keys' study, he shared the data from 7 countries, but he deliberately left out the data from 15 more because it didn't support his hypothesis. And maybe I'll just sort of riff on that for a second if you'll all humor me. We're living in a bizarre time but it's actually one that I enjoy, which is we need to be extraordinarily critical of our experts. That here I am with my illustrious PhD, and aren't I so clever because I know so much? And yet we ought to wonder why a scientist or someone speaking like a scientist, even if they're a clinician, how are they speaking with such certainty? Because the more convinced you are, or the more you embrace an idea and advocate it and say, this is the truth and we're done and we know, then the less of a scientist you've become. Just to riff for one more second, you guys, science is the pursuit of truth. A scientist is a seeker of truth. And the whole pursuit of that truth is actually built on this process of trying to prove yourself wrong. It's trying to nullify your hypothesis. And so the moment you have a scientist, an MD or a PhD with, boy, aren't they so clever with their big degrees, when they tell you, trust the science. Now, I know I hate that there's like deeper, I don't mind that there's some implications here, but I don't want for anyone, I genuinely hope this isn't offensive in all sincerity. But the moment we start to advocate this idea that, no, we know everything there is to know and it's done, then we've stopped being a scientist and now we're just an evangelist. Um, Now we're just preaching sort of a missionary message, rather than trying to rigorously find out truth in the world. So anyway, Josh, back to the question, because I promised I didn't forget it in the midst of my rambling. Where did we all go wrong? That's probably the moment where it got most wrong. And maybe one final criticism of this approach by Ansel Keys to vilify fat, when he gave birth to the Mediterranean diet, which has taken on a life of its own, where he reported that, boy, look at this country in Italy where they eat very little saturated fat, and boy, their rates of heart disease are so low. When they conducted their surveys, their questionnaires, they did it during Lent, which for a Catholic heavy country meant that a sizable number of the population was deliberately avoiding meat because during Lent, as good Catholics, they were denying themselves some of the pleasures of life. And of course, meat is a pleasure. And it was known that that happened at the time. And one scientist wrote about this in a published report after the fact, and he admitted this was a troubling omission, that they didn't confess, evoking the Catholic ideology here, that they didn't confess that they were conducting these surveys during Lent. So it was bad science from the very beginning, and it was embraced with a fervor where it reached a national level and then directly influenced the dietary guidelines. And then the rest is history. As we began to vilify fat, we embraced carbohydrates. And now we live in a culture where globally 70% of all calories consumed come from carbohydrates. And unfortunately, we all know most of those are coming from bags and boxes with barcodes. And Josh, just to help us appreciate this, this is not an American problem alone. In fact, if you look at the rates of type 2 diabetes, one of the most obvious outcomes of insulin resistance, it's actually worse in almost every country in the Middle East and East Asia and Southeast Asia. We're fatter than them, but they're more diabetic. And that's, of course, all based on how people store fat, not how much fat you store.
Interesting. I don't even know how to unpack that. How we can be
Yeah,
fat.
that's a lot. I'm sorry, guys. That's a
No,
lot.
no. I honestly, it was just that last point. We are fatter than them, but they are more susceptible to type 2 diabetes. Dive
Yeah.
into
Oh,
that.
let me go. Let me go.
Because
Unleash me. Should I go on that?
yeah, I'm curious because it doesn't jive with what my thought
Yeah.
process would be.
Yeah. Well, this is a topic that I'm thrilled to talk about because anytime I can talk about the fat cell, I'm happy. It's a good day because that's the cell type we focus on the most in my lab. I am a fat scientist. And this in this case, it's what's important to note is it's not the amount of fat that the human body stores, it's the size of their fat cells. Now, even before we discuss the differences across ethnicities, it's interesting to discuss the differences between the two sexes because women are fatter than men and yet healthier on in every single metabolic metric. And yet that shouldn't be. If it's all just a matter of fat, then women should be metabolically sicker. And yet women are metabolic superheroes pre-menopause. They are like bulletproof. They can have a woman can have substantially higher fat levels than a man does and naturally does, and not have a whiff of metabolic problems, insulin resistance included. It's because she has more fat cells than him, but by having more fat cells, all of the fat cells are sharing the metabolic burden, and thus they're all smaller. The man has fewer fat cells, and his fat cells are all bigger. And it's fat cells that are problematic for two specific reasons. And then to varying degrees, this is what's reflected across the ethnicities. Why do East Asians have such high rates of diabetes, and yet they're overwhelmingly lean by kind of American Caucasian standards? It's because they have such a low level of making new fat cells. So any mass that's gained as fat on that body type is inflating the fat cell. That's a process called hypertrophy. Whereas when you have more fat cells but are smaller, that's a process called hyperplasia, where the fat cell starts to grow and then it starts to multiply and then they're all smaller. The problem with the hypertrophic fat cell is twofold. On one hand, as the fat cell's getting bigger and bigger, it literally starts to reach a point of maximum dimension where the fat cell cannot grow anymore lest it start to break through its cell membrane, which would be very messy, very problematic. Now, what is telling the fat cell to grow? Insulin. Just as a brief tangent, it is utterly, totally, unavoidably impossible for a fat cell to grow unless insulin is elevated. I cannot state that emphatically enough. Everyone comes to this view of obesity that it's just pure calories, calories in, calories out. I can disprove that and do all the time in my lab where we're growing fat cells in little petri dishes, and these fat cells are swimming in a sea of calories and they stay small until we add one single thing, insulin. The moment we add insulin into that petri dish, now the fat cells know what to do with the energy they have, which is to grow. So for a fat cell to grow or for the body to store fat, you must have elevated insulin to tell the fat cell to grow. And then you need sufficient calories to fuel that growth. So I'm not saying calories don't matter. Calories only matter insofar as insulin is telling them to be stored. Now, that was a tangent. So back to the topic. When the fat cell starts to get big, the fat cell is telling it to grow, and then it starts to reach a point of maximum growth, and so it becomes insulin resistant. The fat cell basically tells insulin, hey, you continue to force me to grow. I can't keep listening to you, so I'm going to start leaking out fat. And that's when you start to see the free fatty acids start to go up in the blood. When free fatty acids start to climb and insulin's elevated, that is absolute proof that the fat cells have become insulin resistant. And again, they're doing so to prevent further growth. At the same time, there's a second event occurring, which is that as the fat cells are getting bigger and bigger, they're pushing each other further and further away from the capillaries or the blood vessels. And as they're getting pushed further and further from the blood vessels, they're becoming hypoxic or they're suffocating. And in order to try to correct that hypoxia or that lack of oxygen, the fat cell starts to secrete these molecules that are like little hormones called pro-inflammatory cytokines, multiple of which are measured in the blood tests that we get from Blokes Enjoy, by the way. So some of those inflammatory markers, like C-reactive protein, for example, some of that can be coming from fat cells that are too big. So if a person finds that they have consistent or persistently elevated inflammatory markers, it could be an evidence of really big fat cells, because some of those cytokines act like a trail of breadcrumbs, where when the fat cell is leaking these cytokines, when they come to the blood vessel will bud off a new little capillary, and it will start wiggling its way and growing to that fat cell to help give the fat cell some oxygen, lest the fat cell die from a lack of oxygen. So we have to pity the poor fat cell, because as it's getting so big, these two things that it's doing becoming insulin resistant to prevent further growth, becoming pro-inflammatory to correct the hypoxia, are two things that, while ensuring its own survival, end up promoting insulin resistance and cardiometabolic consequences throughout the body. So, Josh, my whole comment about how some ethnicities will have a lower body fat level, but actually have worse metabolic outcomes is entirely a function of how is that body storing fat, not how much fat, but how, and specifically how big are your fat cells. It is, in fact, this is so apparent that the United States, with the predominantly both Caucasian and then black communities, because blacks are also on that same end of the spectrum as whites, where these are ethnicities that can have more fat cells and thus they're smaller. Here in the US, we have higher rates of obesity. We're among the fattest, although not the fattest. We're among the fattest countries on the planet, but we're not even in like the top 20 of the highest rates of type 2 diabetes. You look across the Middle East and Southeast Asia and East Asia, and they're all worse than we are. And the
I'm
Pacific Islands too, actually.
surprised to
That's
hear that,
incredible.
actually. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
so USA.
yeah, your love language is fat cells. I learned that too.
Oh
So
yeah. Yeah.
anytime you and the wife go out on dates, it's she knows how to get you going, doesn't she? While this is all going, I had just what I think might be a basic question, but it's probably not. Can you be optimal? Can you have optimal insulin levels and be metabolically unhealthy?
Yeah, that would be uncommon. Now let me explain some of the nuance here. Because insulin is a hormone, it does have a circadian rhythm. And in the morning, when most of us are getting our blood test, that actually, in some people, can represent a bit of a flow state of insulin rather than an ebb state. So let's imagine, but again, it depends on the person, their sleep habits, their caffeine consumption, how much protein they ate the night before. All of these are actually variables that will impact what's called the dawn phenomenon, which is this natural elevation in cortisol that starts to happen around 4 to 5 a.m. Again, it depends on the person and their sleep habits. But with that will come an increase in glucose with cortisol and a little bit of insulin coming up, reflective of a kind of momentary insulin resistance, which is not a problem. It's by design in the body. But yeah, if a person got their blood test and they found that their insulin levels were normal, and yet they're thinking, yeah, but I got a high blood pressure and my mom had type 2 diabetes. You know, I check all the boxes. I had a sister who had gestational diabetes, which is kind of type 2 in microcosm of pregnancy. And I'm happy to talk about that if there's interest. But yeah, Josh, so a person could have what appears to be normal insulin, and it was really just they caught it at a low point. But all the more reason to look at some of these other markers like the triglyceride to HDL ratio. That is a very reliable marker of insulin resistance that is less volatile to the natural rhythm of that hormones experience. If your triglyceride divided by HDL cholesterol is less than around 2, and again, it does shift across the ethnicities a little bit. Like in Caucasians, it's about 1.5. In blacks, the cutoff is about 2. In Hispanics and East Asians, I think it's and Southeast Asians around 1. So there's a little bit of wiggle room as there's natural differences in triglycerides and HDL. But around there, if that number is lower, that's a good sign that you're metabolically sound. I would add cardiometabolically because the triglyceride to HDL ratio is a way better predictor of heart disease than LDL cholesterol.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's interesting. When you tell me that, I'm just thinking of a friend, and I won't mention his name, but very active, very fit, yet he has not great insulin levels, not great A1C scores, triglycerides are off the roof, but his family, hereditary, is all type 2 diabetic, but he
Mm.
is extremely fit. So trying to connect the dots there is always a little bit challenging for me.
Yeah, no, I get it. There's no doubt, though. In a pattern that is not able to be defined with specific genes, In other words, there are no specific genes that a scientist can point to and say, you're insulin resistant, or even, you're type 2 diabetic. But there's undeniable familial influence where if someone has this as a familial pattern, it is not their destiny, but it is something they're going to have to struggle with. And those are people who are going to have to be a little more judicious, perhaps, than someone else.
Awesome. So one of the things, we do a fair amount on is testosterone. We love talking about testosterone. That might be my love language.
Yeah.
Uh, and as we know, both men and women need optimal ranges of testosterone. Talk about metabolic health and insulin and how that affects the body's ability to produce testosterone.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely am a great defender and advocate of sex hormone scrutiny as well. The sex hormones are just fascinating. One of the things I love being a professor, as much as I have a general and growing hatred of academia. I think it's a cesspool of rotten ideologies for the most part. But I am teaching a class right now called endocrinology, and we're literally just starting next week the gonads. So we're going to talk all about these sex hormones. Both sets, estrogens and androgens, have extraordinarily powerful metabolic effects. For example, one of the reasons why a woman can have higher body fat levels but be substantially healthier is because of her estrogens. Estrogens allow a woman, I know that's not what you asked, but I promise I'll get to testosterone.
Totally.
But estrogens allow a woman, and to a lesser degree, a man, we also have estrogens, albeit to substantially lower levels by design. The higher levels of estrogens in the woman allow her to really shrug off the consequences of body fat in the negative consequences. And in fact, gals, you'll be delighted and perhaps a little befuddled to know that at any given moment, you're burning 40% more fat than your male counterpart is. Like right now, Katie's listening, Josh is listening. Katie's turnover of fat from her fat cell is 40% higher than his. And this is reflected. There aren't a lot of tests clinically where you have to have a different metric for males and females. Of course, sex hormones you do. But one of them is fatty acids, free fatty acids. Free fatty acids, or sometimes called non-esterified fatty acids, can be measured in blood tests, and they are direct products of fat burning from a fat cell. And the gals have such higher levels of free fatty acids that they have to use their own cutoffs, and it's because she's burning so much more fat than the guy is. Now, the gal may be wondering, this is the befuddled comment, well, why am I fatter? Because you're also putting more in. And that's, again, another effect of the estrogens, that while you're breaking down more fat, you're also putting more into the fat cell. And so there's just a higher turnover, which is very healthy, frankly. Now, testosterone isn't going to promote a fat cell turnover. It's just going to promote breakdown. And testosterone generally is it will, two things worth noting. Testosterone will promote a greater degree of central fat storage as opposed to subcutaneous by and large. So the fat that you can pinch and jiggle is generally going to be more of the kind of estrogens based fat storage, whereas the central adiposity or central fat on the core is going to be more androgens based. This is why a gal who goes through menopause in the absence of any hormone replacement, she will literally start to see a subtle shift in how she's storing fat, where there will be less on her, say, buttocks and hips and more on her abdominal region, which starts to make her the metabolic mortal like her husband is. Just to kind of finish that earlier sentiment, when a gal goes through menopause and the drop of estrogens, now she's subject to the consequences of that fat mass, like her husband has been the whole time. So now she becomes immortal. It's her kryptonite, if you will. But testosterone generally promotes an overall greater fat burning state while promoting lean mass growth. So in that sense, it's an incredibly powerful signal for both men and women. Now, there are others who would go beyond and talk about the central effects of testosterone at the brain. I'm not a brain guy. I'm the metabolism guy. I'm the fat cell guy. So I'm just going to stick primarily there. But there's a fascinating interaction between testosterone and fat in both sexes. But if a man has like a hypogonadism where he has too low testosterone, he will absolutely have a greater likelihood of storing fat and indeed storing it in a more female pattern, like subcutaneously, maybe more on his buttocks and hips area in that kind of hourglass shape. No question that's going to happen. And the restoration of the testosterone will absolutely start to result in fat burning and pretty dramatically, depending on where he starts. But at the same time, as part of this kind of bizarre cycle, the problem can start in another way where it's not the testes fault, although it sometimes can be. Sometimes he's simply not making enough testosterone. In another guy, he's making plenty of testosterone. It's just his lifestyle is such, again, elevated insulin, stimulating fat retention, and sufficient calories to fuel that growth of the fat. Now his fat cells actually start to act like ovaries, where fat cells, remarkably, express the same enzyme that the ovaries do, the testes do too, just very low levels, that will convert testosterone into estrogens. It's a little known fact that all estrogens were once testosterone in both sexes. There's just one enzyme called aromatase that mediates that conversion. Insulin will inhibit that, which is why in the woman who starts to experience PCOS, it's because of her high insulin inhibiting her ovaries' ability to convert testosterone into estrogens. She fails to get the estrogens to elevate during the normal surge, and then she fails to ovulate, resulting in PCOS. But in the guy, back to the guy, if he has too much fat cell, he has too much aromatase in his fat cell, and now his fat cells are acting like ovaries, literally taking in the testosterone that the testes made and releasing it as estrogens. So, sort of messing up the whole problem. So, some guys are going to find that their testosterone levels will go up just as they lose weight without any need for intervention. Other guys may tremendously benefit from the intervention of boosting up the testosterone, whether it's with TRT or whether it's with another approach that I know blokes enjoy is used with like enclomiphene, which is a way of just stimulating your own testosterone, just as a funny little tangent. When I first got involved with blokes, I just wanted to experiment. And I said, hey, I want to see what it feels like with higher testosterone. I went on in clomiphene for like 2 months and my testosterone went off the charts. And so like it was such a ridiculously high response that we kind of dosed it down. And so anyway, it can be pretty dramatic. But that's the dynamic between testosterone and fat tissue. And maybe one final point as it relates to the women, where when a woman starts to go through menopause and the ovaries have sort of quieted down their role of sex hormone involvement, the woman's fat cell actually becomes one of the sources of estrogens, where her adrenal glands are making testosterone, and then the fat cell is converting it into estrogens. And so the fat cell actually becomes more of a primary player as the ovaries retreat from making estrogens, which is all a function of your eggs are gone. I mean, that is the transition between premenopause to menopause. You're done ovulating, there's no more eggs. And so the ovaries sort of quiet down. Not that they're gone and not that they're irrelevant, they just quiet down. But then the fat cell actually becomes a little more prominent in that process, particularly converting testosterone into estrogens. Anyway, a lot of answer there, a lot to chew on.
No, I love it. So much of what you said is spot on, and I went through it personally. Now I have my testosterone levels, what I would consider dialed in and feeling great and in the gym and eating better. But the one thing that I'm constantly struggling with as a founder of a company that's growing and scaling is stress and managing my cortisol levels. And we know that has an impact on testosterone, both in men and women. Um, I'd love for you to dive into the role of managing stress, unhealthy stress, and how it ties to just your overall metabolic health.
Yeah. Oh, I'd love to talk about this. So, stress is what I consider to be one of the primary causes of insulin resistance. So, some people, like I see a question here, what's the big deal about insulin? If I haven't maybe made that clear, elevated insulin One, I just explained how it causes PCOS by inhibiting aromatase. Chronically elevated insulin is the leading cause of hypertension, which is itself the leading cause of of hypertension, heart disease rather. Chronically elevated insulin causes insulin resistance of the brain, leading to Alzheimer's disease. Another thing very relevant to ladies, it's one of the few chronic diseases that affects women more than men. Men generally die more from everything, including suicide. And Josh, as a tangent, one of the reasons I'm so passionate about blokes is, if anyone will allow me to wax a little personal for a moment, men nowadays are vilified in society, where men are 5 times more likely to kill themselves. And men never want to talk about these kinds of things. Men don't like getting together, even with other men. And one of my missions, although oddly enough, it's actually within my church group, I do whatever I can to just find opportunities for men to get together, because men will be literally dying of loneliness and you'll never know. And no one will ever tell them thank you. No one will ever. It's these, anyway, gals, like I know most of the people here are gals, and so I don't mean to say, hey, guys got it rough, but let's not totally ignore the guys. And so in all affection and sincerity, one of the things that I'm so pleased with blokes is just creating a community of dudes where, like, we're not weeping and hugging each other in a weird way, but it's like it's okay to talk to guys, and anyway, to focus on your own health. So um I forgot the question.
Stress,
Stress,
cortisol,
thank you so much.
metabolic health.
That
Yeah,
was
so here I
beautiful.
am
That
with
was
my
beautiful, by
Alzheimer's.
the
Yeah, thank you. I
way.
really do feel quite strongly about that topic. And even to the point that as I look at young college-aged males, I know this is so indelicate, and please everyone try to see that I'm not coming at this with a malicious intention. Girls, as a professor, girls are beating boys in everything. Like, who's going more to medical school? Girls are crushing it. Who's going more to PhD programs? Girls are crushing it. I mean, like, literally, the statistics are undeniable. Boys are like more and more a forgotten little group in society, and even at universities. And even still, there will always be posters in my building right now. There's posters of come to a night of girls in medicine and women in science. And I think it already worked. Like, the girls are already
Wow.
literally going to med school at higher rates than boys, 60 to 40%. PhD programs, it's even more. It's like 70 to 30. And I think let's just don't talk about it anymore, because it already worked. Let's just sort
Yeah.
of let nature balance out however it wants to. So, with regards to stress, it is one of the primary causes of insulin resistance. Where, Josh, I could take you, put you in my lab, and give you an injection of cortisol or epinephrine, and you'd feel the epinephrine, mind you. You wouldn't really feel the cortisol. But within the ensuing hours, if I was measuring your insulin resistance, it'd be getting worse and worse and worse, like in real time. So stress is an acute cause of insulin resistance. Independent of that is stress is cortisol's effect on female fertility. Male fertility, which is so much simpler. I like to joke that male fertility is like a barbershop quartet. Female fertility is like a 100-piece symphony. There are so many instruments involved in normal female fertility that it's no surprise that it's very sensitive to the environment, because she has to carry the metabolic burden of reproduction, the burden and the blessing, I hope we could say. But it's no surprise that if her body is sensing, hey, there's something off here, it will disrupt her fertility, although in the guy, it won't as much. Anyway, in both sexes, when the stress hormones go up, which is how I define stress as a kind of hormone minded scientist. It is, what is your cortisol and what is your epinephrine or adrenaline? We call it epinephrine in the US, and the UK and Canada, adrenaline. Although who cares what they think? So epinephrine and cortisol, when they go up, it will cause insulin resistance acutely. Now, what that means for us is, first and foremost, scrutinize your sleep. If you're worried about the role of stress in causing insulin resistance, that is the main variable to look at. How are you sleeping? And one, if I can give one piece of advice, because I know someone earlier was said, well, we just want some actionable intel here. Hopefully I'm giving that in the midst of this, but don't go to bed hyperglycemic. I could guarantee everyone listening, if you go to bed with normal blood sugar levels, you're going to sleep better. One of the most overlooked aspects of elevated blood glucose is that it activates the sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight or flight response. So the individual who's going to bed and they're wondering why their heart is beating so hard and fast, It's not because you're anxious. Like things are fine. It's because you went to bed hyperglycemic. If you wonder why you're so hot and you're constantly kicking off the covers, one reason could be your hyperglycemia. Hyperglycemia is the main cause of elevated body temperature at night, and elevated body temperature at night is the main cause of insomnia. So sleep well, just cut out the carbs before you go to bed.
That's what I was going to ask. Like, what is because I've heard some people say do a fat before, like do a
Yeah,
peanut
yes,
butter with.
absolutely. Take some sleepy time tea or whatever and put in a dab of butter or some coconut oil to stimulate ketogenesis. A paper was just published about 6 months ago that found if you go to bed with elevated ketones, in fact, they used a ketone supplement. If you go to bed with elevated ketones, you not only have literally a physically better recovery from the exercise the day before, but you sleep better. There's total changes in your sleep architecture. And that could just be that the ketones are really fueling the brain well during the night. But regardless, at a minimum, do not go to bed hyperglycemic. You're going to have a terrible night of sleep.
Meaning don't eat too many carbs right before you go
Don't
to
eat
bed.
a lot of starch and sugar. Eat or drink before you go to bed. Yeah, you do not want to go to bed with elevated blood sugar. And that's going to be what you're snacking on. And of course, the great tragedy is twofold, which is people most experience their worst cravings of the day in the evening.
Yep.
Of all the times of the day, that's how I am. I can walk, I could walk past, here's a little confession. I could walk past a bowl of frosted mini wheats all day, and it wouldn't even tempt me the littlest bit. I would look at it and be indifferent to it. But the moment like 7 o'clock comes around, oh, that's like meth. And I'm an addict. And I want to snort 100 lines of that frosted mini wheats. Like I couldn't get enough if I allow myself to even start. So I actually adopt the adage when it comes to like cereal, which is absolutely my weakness. Saint Augustine once stated, abstinence is easier than perfect moderation. One of the reasons I hate the term moderation in all things, and people think they're so clever when they say it. Oh, it sounds so seductively clever. Tell that to an addict. It doesn't work if you're an addict. Some
Mm.
people are addicts, some are not. Like cereal, just for example. If I take a few bites of cereal, I I literally will not stop until it's like coming out my nose. Like I'm not kidding. Like I will eat so much that it hurts. I stop when I think, what the hell did I do? Like an addict. You've binged and you look at this, you're wiping your nose off and you're thinking, I didn't want to do this again. And here I did it again. But my
Well, it's
wife,
designed to make you do that, right? The cereal
it is.
that
But
you're
different personalities will have more or less of a tendency there. My wife, one, she doesn't even have an interest in cereal in the first place, which makes her an absolute alien in my mind. A sexy alien, but an alien. She will eat a little bowl of cereal and then just be done. And I think, what's wrong with you? Like, how do you do that? Because I cannot relate. I am an addict. And in fact, if so, and then the tragedy is that's when people have the cravings the most at bedtime. Now, I had a thought that I know this will be of interest as we're coming to the end of the hour. This is where I actually believe there is the greatest potential for GLP-1 modulation. That as much as we live in a culture where there is just insane fervor with GLP-1 drugs, and I've never seen anything like it. And lest anyone think I'm not qualified to talk about this, maybe none of you do. Thank you if you don't. But my my PhD lab 20 years ago was one of the first funded labs to actually study these drugs, these hormones from the gut, GLP-1 in particular. So I've kept my finger on the pulse of this field since almost the inception of it. There was a paper published in the late 90s, which was just before I started my PhD, and they found that when they looked at carbohydrate, they looked at fat consumption in lean and obese people, and the GLP-1 response was almost just the same. And one of GLP-1's main effects is to tell the brain that you're done. You've reached satiation. You have satiety. But when they ate carbohydrate, the obese group had literally no statistically significant difference in GLP-1. There's a little bit of wiggling, but it was not statistically significant, meaning it was just noise. And then in the lean group, it went up about 4 times higher. So one of the maybe I'm one of those people when I'm eating carbohydrate, I don't get a lot of GLP-1. And so my brain's not really getting the signal to shut off, to turn this down. Whereas my wife perhaps is getting a robust effect. My view on the GLP-1 drugs is that their absolute best use is someone who has learned that they should be controlling their carbs. Not everyone has learned that though. But when they know I need to be controlling my carbs and I just can't do it, no matter how hard I try, it takes an act of superhuman will for me not to start binging every evening. To me, that is the best use of these drugs, where we've given them the information. Hey, you got to really control your carbs, and then they just say, I can't." Like a true addict, it just calls out to me every night, and I cannot stop. All right, let's see what happens when we increase your GLP-1. Although my view is that we want to try to keep that on a lower end, not to like the Wegovy dose, because then we start to struggle with a lot of lean mass loss. So let's increase your GLP-1 and help you learn what it feels like, what it thinks like when you're not constantly being inundated with the call for carbohydrates. And then it's so important that the person is learning the skills, because we want over time for them to be able to wean off that. We want that. And so my view on them is lower doses and even cycling. Like, let's put you on, help you learn what it looks like to eat and feel when the carbohydrate craving is quiet. And then let's see how you do when we start to wean you off. Were able to learn some lessons? Were you able to develop a little greater self-discipline or create some strategies? Hey, you were? Well, then you're good. You're done. Awesome. High five. Or, hey, it's starting to come back. Okay, let's cycle on again and just see how you do. So, lest I know in social media, I have really become outspoken and critical of GLP-1 drugs just because I worry about the dose. And as a college professor, frankly, I worry about the number of young, healthy girls who are going on it as just a way to feel better about their eating disorder. And they're getting like the bones of 80-year-olds. It is like when I see a lean girl, I have a cousin who's totally lean and she now looks like a corpse.
Mm.
And I know that it's just an eating disorder, unfortunately. Anyway, I sound kind of critical, and I hate that it sounds like I have a universal dislike. And I never wanted to come off at that. It's just my voice seems so shrill in this space because no one else is really focusing on some of the considerations. I believe these drugs can absolutely have a place. There's no doubt that there are people who do not get the same GLP-1 response to certain foods, specifically carbohydrates, that other people get. And so my view is that their best use is essentially helping someone learn how to follow a diet that is lower in carbohydrate and then prioritizing proteins and natural fats.
I I love that. And by the way, your opinions are always welcome here, whether we agree or not. My personal struggle with food was got pretty bad. And I was 265 pounds in my height. And I took semaglutide, didn't have a great experience with that. And then I took tirzepatide, had a great experience with that because the side effects were just almost diminished. But it was the first time in my life, especially for years and years of being what I would consider obese chronically, that took a lot of, I basically damaged every bit of my GLP-1s, damaged my metabolic health, my testosterone. It finally gave me that edge, or what I like to say, momentum in health, momentum and choosing the right foods. And I think your approach is solid. I think having people allowing them to curb some of their cravings over time, not starting with these monster doses. I think it's really, to some extent, it's gotten out of hand. But to your point, there's a time and a place for these medications.
Yeah, yeah, well said.
Well, I think we're dang near to the end. I could go on for probably another hour. I know you got
Let's
other.
do it again. I'm here.
Let's
I'm
do
in
it
the
again.
stable.
I think that the next session we'll talk about actionable items. We took some questions from the group prior. I think you covered quite a bit of it. Katie, do you have anything that you want to say before we wrap up?
I don't. This was wonderful, and we Kate helped us take some wonderful notes, so we'll send out a transcript, we'll send out the replay, and we'll do a lot more with all of the great nuggets that we learned today. So you'll be seeing some more coming out from this.
Ben, if you have anything else, feel free, but we appreciate your
No,
time
it's great.
and We know you're busy and you're the best in the business when it comes to this. So we are extremely grateful.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks, guys. We are totally mission aligned. And sometimes there's an opportunity to teach a principle, and there are people who can put it into practice, like what you guys are doing. So I'm thrilled.
Awesome, man.
Thank
Thank you
you.
guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Take care,
Bye,
guys.
everybody. Bye
everyone.
bye.